Now I'm going to explain to you the precise details that you need to know about these planned economic systems. A planned economy, remember I explained briefly in the last video, it simply means a situation when the economy of a country is run by its government. The government in these planned economies, we say, own all of the limited resources of a country, and the government alone makes all the decisions of what they're going to do with these resources. And the way I'm going to proceed in this video is that I will first of all give you a very brief and a very quick overview of how countries using these planned economic systems are run in general, and what are some of the benefits of using these planned economic systems, and what are some of the issues and problems faced by countries running these planned economic systems. And those problems we'll see are quite serious. They are the reasons why most of the countries that have tried to use these planned economies, they have often struggled. And speaking of the countries which have used these planned economic systems, the two major countries that use these planned economies are Russia and China. So for most of the 20th century, these countries were running a planned economic system. And currently, there are very few countries that are still using this planned economy. But if you have to think of an example, then Cuba is one of those rare examples, a country still running its economy on the planned economic system. Now, the way the economies of these planned systems work is that, you see, the government, they literally own all of the land, labor, capital, and enterprise, and the government basically tries to identify what the country needs, and then the government just sort of decides which resources that it's going to use to make those things. So if the government feels that the country maybe needs a lot of steel, then the government will just allocate some piece of land, it will just decide which piece of land, and then it would just allocate some of the resources and make a factory over there, and then it would just assign some of the people that, look, you don't have any choice. I own the labor, and I am ordering you that you need to go work here and, let's say, make steel. Why? Well, because the government thinks that it is the steel that this country needs the most at this time, and therefore the government decides to allocate some of the scarce resources it owns towards the production of this particular product. And similarly, the government will decide, let's say, how much of food is going to be produced, what piece of land is going to be used, who are the people who are going to work there as farmers, and so on and so forth. And once all of these products have been produced, the government will take ownership of all of these things and decide how they are going to distribute them amongst the different people. So all the economic decision making in a planned economic system is done by a government, and this is literally how these economic systems work in reality. But let us just stick to a very theoretical build-up of this whole analysis, and let us introduce the next assumption of this planned economic system, which is that the motive of the government in making all of these decisions will always be to attain the maximization of collective welfare of the entire society. So we are not going to go into the debate of whether the government is corrupt or not. We are going to assume a benevolent social planner, the government who is working for the welfare of the entire society. Now, the requirement of the A-level syllabus asks you or needs you to know some of the benefits of this planned economic systems. But I will just go through them very quickly, and these are just some points that you need to remember and throw in your essay questions. But we are not going to go into the details because I want to focus here on the problems of this planned economic system. That is what we need more. So the benefits, let me just explain first of all that the biggest benefit of this planned economic system is that, at least on paper, it is a sort of system that will achieve more fairness and more equality out of whatever you do with these limited resources. Why? Because if the government is working for the benefit of the entire society, then most of the country, they have very few resources, in the sense that there are always people who are so poor that they don't even possess basic necessities such as food or clothing or shelter or any other basic necessity you can think of. So a government deciding how to use these resources to get the maximum welfare of the entire society will always first and foremost ensure that most of these resources go towards producing enough of these basic necessities so that each individual has access to these basic things. And therefore, in these sort of economies, we usually see that the government will end up producing more necessities and fewer luxuries. And therefore, the system, we say, is more fair and it's more equitable. And this is actually true about some of the current planned economies. The rare case is of Cuba, which still uses this planned economic system. Now, overall, it's a very poor country, but they do have one of the best health systems in the world, and they do have one of the highest illiteracy rates anywhere in the world. And all of this health and education is totally free to all of the Cuban citizens. And then there are some other benefits which are very interesting to talk about in detail, but again, I want to keep them very short. So just remember that in these planned economies, there will be less pollution and there will be more of good things such as public goods that will be produced. Now, the technical way of saying that there will be less pollution is that this government will care about externalities and it will not just blindly go after profit. So if there is some production process that is maybe profitable, but it creates a lot of smoke or pollution, and then the government, thinking of the welfare of the entire society, will just also care about pollution, and therefore, overall you will end up having a cleaner environment. And these good things, these public goods, remember, again, we will talk about them in detail, but just at this point, remember that these are the sort of goods that provide satisfaction to the consumers. These are good things for the society, but it is impossible to make a profit by producing and selling them. But again, this government, since it's not going after profit, it's going after what is good for the society, so it will end up producing sufficient amounts of public goods. Now, as examples, remember, public goods, we are talking about things like public parks and street lights and so on and so forth. Again, we will look at the details of what these are at the very end of this course. But that pretty much is all that is good about this planned economic system. There are other things that we can add, but this is enough over here. But remember that the system only looks good on paper. And in reality, whenever countries have tried to run their economies according to this planned economic systems, yes, they have attained some of these benefits. They have seen some periods of good economic activity, but overall, by and large, these planned economic systems struggled and eventually collapsed. And the biggest reasons and the biggest theoretical explanations of why the system will not work is that the system will totally lack any incentives. And this is an important word for you to remember. You will see this again and again in your MCQs. There is no incentive in a planned economic system. And what we mean by that is, if you go back to this example of a steel factory, we are saying that the government literally owns all the land, all the capital, all labor, and all the enterprise. Which basically means for you as individuals that you don't even get to decide what is the sort of job that you are going to choose, because the government will come and tell you that, look, we own all the labor that exists in this society, and we are going to tell you whether you are going to become a teacher or a farmer or an artist or whatever the government wants you to produce. Now, if you are forced to go and work in a steel factory or any other job, that is where we are saying that, look, you will have no incentive because you don't have any choice to pick this job, first of all. And then the product that you are producing, it is not going to be sold for a profit, and you are not going to earn any bonuses or things like that. You just need to do what the government is telling you. And once you have made that steel, the government will take it away and it will decide what it's going to do with that steel. So there are no potential customers that you want to impress. There is no incentive to sort of be better than your colleagues or co-workers, or to improve efficiency or reduce the wastage. Just think of any government-owned organization. People there don't really care about the wastage that they are creating. Why? Because, they don't own any of those resources. It's the government that owns all of those resources. And that lack of motivation, that lack of incentive means that in the long run, you will end up with an economy which is producing goods of low quality, and there is going to be no after-sale service. There is going to be no sort of, looking after the customer, because these people won't care whether the customer is happy or not. And then since there is no profit incentive, these people won't care whether their product is good or better than the other factory or so on and so forth. So you will end up with very low quality basic products, and there will be no variety. Because there is no incentive for any one of them to be innovative or think like an entrepreneur and come up with a new idea, because they don't own any resource and therefore they cannot conduct any production on their own. So that lack of incentive sort of, sucks the life out of this whole planned economic system, if you think about it. And that is where in the long run we say that, you will not be able to end up using these resources in the best possible way. You will end up wasting these resources. And that is not all. what is very important over here is that, look, if you think that the government knows what the society wants, then you are totally ignoring the self-interest or the wants of the consumers. Because this assumption is a very shady assumption that the government would always know what I want. You and I and all of us as consumers, we are in the best position to know what we want. But here in this planned economic system, the assumption is that the government is able to somehow magically know and understand what the people want. And this assumption simply means that the consumer is totally ignored in this particular system. So the government may end up using the limited resources to produce things that eventually the people don't want. And if that's not all, here comes the biggest practical issue with this planned economic system, the issue of coordination. Because even if you assume that there is no problem because of these incentives, and even if you assume that the government is somehow able to identify exactly what the people want, then think about it. We are saying that it's the single government that will make all the decisions regarding how these resources are going to be used, which in simpler language means that the government is going to decide how many cars are going to be produced, how many schools are going to be produced, how many fans, how many TVs, and whatever you can think of. And then the government is coordinating everything related to who will supply the inputs, how much of it will be made, where it will be made, and so on and so forth. And that is where we say that, look, even with all the good intentions and the most hardworking of governments, it will always become impossible to coordinate all of these production processes. And the government will somehow make mistakes. And that is actually what happened in the planned economic systems of China. In near 1970s, the planned economic system of China, the government decided that, look, we need to make a lot of steel. So they decided and, started using most of these resources and sent most of their people to newly built steel manufacturing plants. And yes, they achieved a lot of steel output. But then suddenly after a couple of years, they realized that, look, we haven't been allocating enough resources to make food and we are running out of food. And that is where the most infamous famine, Great Famine of China came in. So that is where we say that, look, the government will somewhere make a mistake despite all the good intentions. And as these planned economic systems grow in size and become larger, then these problems of coordination, they will only become more serious and more frequent. Because in a larger planned economy, the government will have to make a lot of economic decisions and it will have to sort of, ensure that a lot of different parts work in harmony with each other. So this coordination will become even more complicated. And that is exactly why in most of the planned economies, what you saw was that there were always imbalances. That is, the government would overproduce and create a surplus of some goods, and it would underproduce and create a shortage of some other goods. In fact, the pictures, the images that became symbolic of the planned economies of Russia and China were pictures of people standing in long queues waiting outside of shops because there were shortages of so many different products. And these shortages, these queues, they became part of the daily life of the Russians living in this planned economic system, which eventually collapsed in 1991. And this is how I want you to understand and have a negative view of this planned economy. A system that looks good on paper, but in reality it doesn't work. To implement the system, you really have to overcome these issues of lack of incentives and coordination problems, which is not easy. And I will leave you now with a small clip that captures what the system of planned economy did to Russia and the individuals living there when it was tested or experimented with for almost 64 years before collapsing in 1991. And the two main pictures that you will see in this clip are those of Karl Marx, who was the main proponent of this planned economic system, and Vladimir Lenin, who was the main implementer of this system in Russia.
Those who ran the Soviet Union had believed that they could plan and manage a new kind of socialist society. But they had discovered that it was impossible to control and predict everything. and the plan had run out of control. But rather than reveal this, the technocrats began to pretend that everything was still going according to plan. And what emerged instead was a fake version of the society. The Soviet Union became a society where everyone knew that what their leaders said was not real, because they could see with their own eyes that the economy was falling apart.